Hello again, and welcome to our next module here in the class. And in this module, we're making a little bit of a transition. So we've been talking about St. Athanasius and looking at his work. And last time we talked about his epic battle with the Arians. And we're going to be shifting gears a little bit here. So we're moving, in chronological terms, only a little bit. St. Augustin, the figure we're going to be looking at here for the next part of our course, really only comes after St. Athanasius by a couple of decades. But we are making a shift from the Eastern Christianity, the Greek-speaking and Greek-writing Christianity of Athanasius, over to the Latin West with Agustin. So there's going to be a shift in language. There's also kind of a shift in character. And Agustin is also a very different figure in many ways in terms of the life and the role that he plays in the church. So really what I want to just do in this module is provide a basic introduction to St. Augustine. So we're going to do a little bit of a discussion of an overview of his life, some of the key events that happen, also looking at kind of the historical context. What are the big things going on in Augustine's world that are going to shape his works and the works that we're going to be reading over the next few weeks. And then talk about some of the key conversions that Augustine goes through over the course of his life, and try to wrap all of that up in a way that really gives us a sense of how is it that St. Augustine works as a theologian, right? Again, our whole goal in all of this is to use these different figures as models for how theology ought to be done, right? And I think St. Augustine is the perfect example of that. We can see how his life is really shaped by and responds to the life of the church in his day. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can see that in Augustine's life here in this module as a way of kind of foreshadowing hopefully what we will develop in a lot more detail over the next few weeks as we read what Augustine writes about all of these different works. And hopefully this will be helpful because Augustine really does address so many different topics. He writes on more or less every issue in theology in his day. And this is, again, where he's a little different from Athanasius, whose concerns are more focused. And in Augustine's case, what he writes about all of these different issues, in most cases becomes kind of definitive for Western Christianity in the centuries following him. But it's so broad and so spread out, we can kind of lose the forest for the trees, if you will. So I do want to lay out some key themes that I would see in Augustine's life here at the beginning as a way of kind of setting the stage and hopefully giving us some kind of guideposts or principles that can organize our thought as we look at all of these different issues over the next few weeks. So that's kind of the goal, is just an introduction to Augustine. For some of you, if this is a little bit of review, I apologize, but hopefully it will still be helpful. And for some of you, you may not know a lot about Augustine's life and time, so hopefully it will be some helpful context. And then I'm going to conclude this introductory module on Augustine by sending you off to read about Augustine's life in his own words. So Augustine wrote a number of famous works, but perhaps the most famous, even for those outside of the Christian world, is Augustine's Confessions. And because Augustine himself tells the story of his life, kind of late in life, looking back on this experiences he's had, that he sees ultimately, of course, leading him to his relationship with God. And so I'm going to give you some snippets from the Confessions to read so you can get a sense of who Augustine is as a person before we dive into his more specifically theological works. So that's kind of the rough plan we have for today. So let's cover some of the very basics here. Like I said, he's a generation or two after Athanasius. So Augustine lives from 354 to 430. So the end of the 4th century into the beginning of the 5th century. And also, as I said, Augustine lives in a different area and speaks a different language. So both Athanasius and Agustin live in North Africa, but Athanasius over in the eastern part of North Africa speaks Greek in Alexandria. Augustine over much further west in North Africa and much closer to Rome speaks Latin and writes in Latin. So there's a very different culture there, right? That North Africa, Western North Africa in Augustin's period is sort of Roman suburbs, if you will, that it is a very Romanized place, and the culture is shaped by Rome, whereas over in Alexandria in Egypt, the older, more Eastern culture is very strong there, right, and persists through the Roman period with a much more Eastern character to it. But Augustin's part of Africa is very Roman, very Latin. Now, if you'll remember from what I talked about in setting the stage for Athanasius, at this period, this is kind of in the 4th century, we kind of really reach the height of patristic theology, right? This is when a lot of the greatest church fathers are doing their work. And at this point, in the late 4th century, the late 300s, Latin theology is really starting to develop. We get people like Ambrose, we get people like Agustin, and so on. So you're starting to get a little more activity in terms of Latin contribution to theology. But it is still kind of a definite second place to the Greek-speaking East. So most of the sophisticated theology is still going on in the eastern part of the world. And Augustine has some sense of this, right? There are translations of it, as we talked about the life of Anthony getting translated into Latin very quickly. So they do have some sense of what's going on, but there's a definite lag, and as we get further into the 400s, into the 5th century, things really kind of start to splinter more, right? As the empire is facing issues, which we'll talk about here in a second, the lines of communication start to break down, and so you get less dialogue back and forth between East and West as we move into the so-called Dark Ages after the Roman Empire. So Latin theology is starting to pick up steam, but still kind of in its infancy. Now, there are those differences, but there are, of course, some similarities, too, between Athanasius and Augustine, right? Augustine, too, is living in the century following the legalization of Christianity. And there are still aftermaths of those persecutions and the legalization and popularization of Christianity after Constantine. So in Augustine's North Africa, they are also facing this issue of huge influx of people coming into the church who are not necessarily doing it purely out of the zeal of their commitment to the faith, right? That you have a lot of cultural or social Christians coming into the church, and that presents all kinds of challenges, both in terms of dealing with maybe some very lax behavior on their part, and also then figuring out how to deal with the much more zealous Christians and some of the ways they might react to all of these unwashed masses coming into the church. So Augustine is going to face those challenges, much like Athanasius did in his experience. Now, the Arianism that Athanasius spends his life fighting with certainly does have effects in the West, although in terms of chronology and history, the Arianism comes into the western part of the empire, or Western Europe, at a later date because the barbarians that end up conquering the western part of the Roman Empire themselves tend to be Arian and become Arian. So there's it's not the Roman Empire becoming Arian in the West, it's the barbarian invaders being Arian or becoming Arian that is the problem that they have to deal with. But that happens, that's more of a crisis in the centuries after Augustine. Right? Augustine isn't dealing primarily with Arianism in his time and in his career. But he does have his problems, right? So he has to deal with a number of different isms. Manichaean Ism or Manichaeism is one, and this is, you could call it a heresy, but it's really kind of a different religion that was very popular in North Africa during Augustine's life, and as we'll talk about, he himself is part of it for a period of time. So he has to deal with Manichaeanism, or Manichaeanism, there's different ways you can say it, just sound confident whichever way you choose. And then he also has to deal with one of the biggest crises he faces is Donatism, which is a ism, a heresy that's really focused on North Africa, and it is driven by, among other things, some of these much more zealous Christians kind of rejecting the broader church as having been polluted both by compromises that some Christians made during the persecutions, and then the welcoming of everybody in after the persecutions end. So Augustine has to deal both with kind of strange, cultish, foreign religions or heresies on the one hand, and also very strict authoritarian, schismatic Christians on the other hand. So he certainly has his hands full in terms of dealing with heresy and controversy throughout his career, much like Athanasius, although, of course, in Augustine's case, he never has to face the same kind of political pressure. He's never exiled, for example, as a result of some of these controversies. And then one last issue to just make sure we reference, I've already mentioned it in passing, that Augustine has to deal with, is this collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And so when Augustine dies in 430, the barbarians are literally at the gates of his city, right? The city is under siege when Augustine dies, and so one of the issues that Augustine has to deal, along with all these other things we've been talking about, it is the fact of these barbarian invasions, right? Which Augustine, as a bishop, has a pastoral responsibility for his people, and obviously there's going to be a lot of turmoil in people's lives as this happens, as the Roman Empire collapses, and as these barbarians come in and either conquer and pillage or come in and set up shop. So Augustine is going to have to address how Christians ought to respond to that political upheaval as well. So all of those things are going to be influencing Augustine's work as we look at his thought on all these different areas within theology. Now, given that broader context, I also want to talk just a little bit more specifically about Augustine's life, right? Because Augustine's life is very well known, and I think it does help us think about his theology if we can kind of know the experiences that he went through. So as I said, Augustine is born in 354. He is born to sort of upper middle class parents. Very famously, of course, his mother Monica is a very devout Christian. His father is a pagan who converts on his deathbed. And they try to give Augustine a good upbringing. So Monica, of course, has him instructed in the basics of the Christian faith, but he is never baptized as a child, right? And so now this may seem odd to many people, right, given the fervor that we all know that St. Monica has for her children's well-being spiritually, right? Why wouldn't she have Augustine baptized? Well, at this point in church history, it is very common for people to postpone baptism until later in life. And there's a whole host of reasons for this, but the main reason is that, as I may have mentioned in some of the discussion posts earlier, the Sacrament of Confession, as we know it, as we experience it, hadn't really developed into the form that we know at this point in church history, right? So sacramental confession was typically reserved for very serious sins. So if you committed adultery, or if you killed someone, or if you did something kind of along on that sort of a scale, there would be this official confession and penitential process that you would go through, and the penances could be very severe, right, which could include basically the remainder of your life kind of kneeling as a penitent outside of church. So post-baptismal sin, if it was of a serious kind, was a very serious issue at this point in the church's development of that doctrine, of that practice. As a result of this, right, a lot of people would put off baptism, right, because there is no penance required for the sins forgiven in baptism. And so, especially if you thought you might sow some wild oats, so to speak, in your youth, you would want to be baptized after that, right, so that you would not have to bear the penance, which would be very severe in many cases. Now, obviously, this is not a good spiritual practice, and obviously, this isn't a sort of ideal pastoral arrangement, which, of course, is, I think, why over the centuries the church moves away from that sort of model towards more of what we think of today when we think of confession or reconciliation. But all of that is to say that it was very common to put off baptism until later in life in Augustine's age. And that's what Augustine, in his case, does. He's not baptized as a child. But he is provided the basics of a Christian education, and his parents also recognize that Augustine has some talent as a scholar, or as an intellectual, or a student, and so he gets an education in his small town there in North Africa, and he kind of quickly reaches the limits of what's available there, so his parents do send him to the bigger city of Carthage. So in Carthage, Augustine travels there. It's kind of like the regional capital, and is able to continue his studies and take them further in Carthage. Now, of course, when he moves away to school, as is often the case, he adopts a fairly wild lifestyle. Although, again, I'll give you some excerpts from the Confessions to read. You probably know, right, that this is a major theme in Augustine's work in the Confessions, is to talk about the sinfulness of his lifestyle prior to his conversion to the Christian faith. And he does seem to have enjoyed himself quite a bit. He parties with his friends, and he has a mistress. He has a concubine, if you will. Now, we often get this sense from Augustine and from accounts of Augustine that he was just this great womanizer, right? That he was just had all kinds of partners all through his life. In reality, if you actually read the Confessions and look at Augustine's account of all this, he does seem to have been very limited, really, from a modern perspective at least, in terms of the wildness of his lifestyle and partners. He was, it seems, very faithful, in fact, to this initial relationship that he has. And he ultimately has a child from one of his concubines, if you will, or his mistress. And Augustine, it seems, would have married her, in fact, but because of the social norms of his day, she is of a lower class and is not a suitable wife, and so he's never able to make that marriage official, which of course ultimately works out in the end. But all of this is to say that Augustine will tell us about this life he leads in very kind of passionate terms, about this passionate lifestyle he's leading. And this is not to undermine the idea that he does really struggle with temptation for all kinds of bodily pleasures, but he is also not some sort of like Hugh Hefner playboy that some of us might think he was, right? That his partying, in terms of like 21st century reality TV terms, for example, would be very tame from many modern perspectives today. All of that, though, really kind of course, picks up in Carthage when he's off at school. And while he's at Carthage, he also falls in with this group, the Manicheans, which is a sort of unusual mix of Eastern religion and Christianity. It's dualistic, right? So that it has a good spiritual realm and a bad bodily realm. It was a very kind of cultish sort of religion. We'll talk more about it in a future module. But he falls in with this group along with his partying and his keeping of a mistress. But here too, right, Carthage only offers so many opportunities, and Augustine is clearly an excellent student and an excellent developing scholar, and so he needs to go somewhere else. And so, in part through his connections he makes within this Manichaean group, he ultimately moves across the Mediterranean to Italy. And he takes up in Rome, and then ultimately moves from Rome to Milan. And Milan is in fact where kind of the imperial capital was at that time. And the imperial capital is moving because of these pressures from invading barbarian hordes. My Germanic ancestors, thank you very much. So Augustine kind of leaves North Africa and heads off to the capitals of Rome and then Milan, right? And so he really kind of takes his next step in his career and education, if you will, there. And so he goes to Rome, he goes to Milan, he begins teaching rhetoric, so he teaches public speaking, he teaches how to make persuasive arguments, and then ultimately, He in fact ends up as a official court rhetorician, right? So he's the official speech maker at the imperial court. And so really what has happened here is Agustin would be a great rags to riches kind of story, or the American dream kind of in North Africa several centuries before America comes into existence. But he really reaches kind of the pinnacle of his career. He is one of the most noted scholars or intellectuals of his day when he is at that imperial court in Milan as a kind of official rhetor, official speaker of the imperial court. So he's really gone about as high up as he can go in the terms of his career, in the terms of his education. Now, during all of this period, of course, he's going through a lot of personal struggles, right? So a lot of the just kind of college-type wildness and craziness has fallen away as he has matured. During this time in Italy, he has moved away from the Manicheans, and he has started reading philosophy. And so he's trying to pursue more serious things. He's trying to pursue the truth and virtue. But he finds himself unable to ultimately break free from certain aspects of his sinful life, in particular his intimate relationship with first his mistress, his long-term mistress. But when that relationship is kind of forced apart by the social norms of their families, he does take up with a succession of a couple of other mistresses. And he just can't break free from this, even though he knows that he ought to. And so he struggles with this for some time. But then he also comes under the influence, very famously, of St. Ambrose. And Ambrose is the bishop there in Milan. And through his study of philosophy, through his exposure to St. Ambrose and to a more sophisticated understanding of the Christian faith than he was really exposed to as a child, it sets the groundwork for him to finally make his conversion. And of course, the conversion finally happens, as Agustin explains it in the Confessions, which I'll have you look at, through kind of a divine intervention, right? That Agustin has this experience of hearing a voice telling him to take up and read. So he picks up the scriptures that are there, he reads them, the passage strikes him, and he and then and there decides that he is going to officially enter into the church and goes through the process, is baptized. He spends a few years as a lay Christian. He kind of adopts a monastic or semi-monastic lifestyle, trying to think about the faith, think about truth and goodness with a handful of friends. But then ultimately he is ordained when he's back in North Africa, and several years after his ordination as a priest, he becomes a coadjutor bishop with the elderly bishop of Hippo, and then ultimately, of course, becomes the bishop of Hippo, which he then is for the last 30 plus years of his life. So that, in a fairly big nutshell, is the life of St. Augustine. Now I want to step back for a moment and look at a couple of these key conversions that happen in Augustine's life, because a lot of times we're all familiar with, or many of us perhaps are familiar with, the story of Augustine's conversion, right? His mother Monica prays for him fervently, he feels God working in his heart, ultimately he has this experience in the garden and he converts. But of course, one of the things I think that is true of most conversion stories, I won't say all, but basically all of them in my experience, is that it's never just that one moment, right? That the conversion is actually, in most cases, a longer process, right? And there's actually a series of conversions that Augustine goes through leading up to that definitive change and entry into the church. Right? So Augustine really reaches, so to speak, his low point in life when he's there in Carthage, and then in his early years coming over into Italy, when he is living kind of this life of pleasure, again, not kind of reality TV level, but certainly not controlling his desires in any real way. And he is also fallen under this Manichaean group, this Manichaean, I think it would be kind of more of a cult in our terms, but they have this very simplistic view of the world, where everything is dualistic, and you can divide everything into good and bad. But that's kind of the low point. Augustine, as a good thinker, as a good scholar, comes to recognize that the Manichaean system just doesn't make sense. And so he becomes dissatisfied with Manichaeanism as a way of answering kind of the big questions about life. And so that starts him on this process, right? And so kind of the first step in his conversion, or his first mini-conversion, is moving away from Manichaeanism and shifting more to philosophy, right? And so he starts to read philosophy. He reads Neoplatonic thinkers mostly. And so the Neoplatonic movement or school of thought is obviously rooted in Plato, right? So Plato is the Greek philosopher, and of course we've mentioned him a little before, but famous for this idea of the forms, or essences, intellectual or immaterial forms or essences that are kind of the real reality. That's what really is the ideal that we ought to be aiming for. That's what's really real, really good and true, if you will. And that this physical world that we experience is shaped by these immaterial forms. And to that extent is good, but that what we ought to be doing is moving away from the physical to this contemplation of the immaterial, of the ideal. And so there's a lot of resonances there with aspects of Christian thought. And so Neoplatonism actually does have a lot of influence on the Church Fathers in the patristic period. And it is a good sort of preparation, if you will, for Augustine's ultimate conversion to Christian thinking. It allows him, amongst other things, one of the things Augustine talks about struggling with is when he hears accounts of God. He can't think of God as anything but a material being. So when he reads the Bible, he isn't able to conceive of God except as some powerful heavenly being with a body, much like you encounter in, say, for example, the Greek myths. And so he's reading these passages about God in anthropomorphic or bodily terms. He's reading them literally, and this is causing him a great deal of trouble. And so studying Neoplatonic philosophy allows him to break free from that, right? To think about God as an immaterial being, that God doesn't have a body. And with that philosophy, learning to read some of these accounts of God that are given in bodily terms allegorically, right? That this is a symbolic language or an allegorical language that can have truth in it, but we don't have to think of God in these bodily, finite, changeable terms. And so that's a really crucial step for Augustine, because he had earlier in life dismissed Christianity as kind of barbaric and simple, because he reads all of the Old Testament stories in particular just very literally, and the God that he sees working there doesn't strike him as what God ought to really be like. And so this ability to think of God in more philosophical terms is really helpful for him in terms of his ultimate conversion. Right. The other big step then, so he converts from the Manichaeanism to the philosophy, and then he is able then ultimately to convert all the way into being a Catholic and being baptized as a Christian. Now, how does this happen, right? Well, so he converts to the philosophy, to the philosophical way of life, but as I mentioned before, right, even though now he knows that he ought to be aiming for truth and goodness and beauty and away from kind of these lower passions, very Platonic idea there, he finds himself unable to do it, right? That Plato can give a fairly persuasive account of how one ought to live, but just reading Plato doesn't seem to give Augustine the ability, the power to actually follow through on that. So this is something that he really struggles with for quite a bit of time. During this period, though, he's also, as I mentioned, he meets St. Ambrose, right? And Ambrose has a real, I think, important influence on Augustine, in that this is a figure who is very intelligent, very sophisticated in thinking, but is also a very faithful, very pious Christian. Augustine recounts one time coming into Ambrose's study and seeing him there, and Ambrose is looking at a text and reading it silently. And Augustine is just very struck by this. Now, why is Augustine surprised and struck by Ambrose reading this text quietly? Well, in the ancient world, this is a very unusual thing, right? And in ancient reading and writing, it works differently than what we have. So they hadn't developed the tools which we take for granted of spaces between words and a lot of the punctuation marks that we would use. And so to read a text in the ancient world, you would literally sound it out, right? That you would have just this mass of letters with no separations between them, and so you would have to sound out loud the sounds to figure out what the words were. And so the ability to read silently to yourself was pretty unusual. And so Augustine is struck by this bishop. And of course, like many young people, his association with the faith of his parents was of this, it's a simplistic thing, it's not very sophisticated. So he kind of dismisses it as this know-it-all, smart young kid. So encountering Ambrose is very helpful for him in seeing somebody who is really obviously intellectual, obviously sophisticated, but is still a very committed believer. So that is helpful to him. Hearing Ambrose explain the scriptures in his homilies is helpful, right? And coming to understand that some of these stories in the Old Testament ought not to be taken literally, or we ought not to apply Old Testament laws in a very literal way in our own time. So coming to appreciate that way of interpreting Scripture is also very important. And so that kind of, those things clear the last intellectual hurdles, if you will, for Augustine to kind of fully embrace the Christian faith. But again, he's unable to make that final leap to give up the lifestyle that he has developed at this point and really embrace Christianity, and of course, most importantly, embrace the chaste living that this is going to require for him as an unmarried man. And he very famously, recounts during this process saying to God, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. And that he has this ideal of what he wants, but he is unable to take that step of really giving up this sinful life that he has adopted and embrace obedience, including chastity, most notably in his case. But then that final conversion happens through kind of God reaching out directly to him in this famous incident in the garden, right? So Augustine is struggling with all of this. He's in a garden and he hears this voice, a voice like a child saying, take up and read, right? And he thinks to himself, right, that's kind of an odd thing to hear a kid saying out of the middle of nowhere. So he takes this as not just a random remark, but that this is directed to him. And if you look in the Confessions, he actually compares this to St. Anthony, whose life we read, and where he has this moment where he hears this key bit from the gospel about selling his possessions and pursuing a life with God. Augustine thinks about himself having a similar experience. So he hears this voice, take up and read. He picks it up. He reads this passage from Romans 13 that talks about not living a life of partying and carousing and riotous living, but living a life of faith. And he takes that as kind of an ultimate sign, right? So this breaks down his defenses. He commits himself to a Christian life, and he's ultimately brought into the church. So Augustine's conversion, that's the famous episode, but it's really something that gets built up to by his struggles with these other things, and by his adoption, amongst other things, of Greek philosophy and a sophisticated way of reading Scripture that really sets the stage for the dramatic conversion. Okay, so again, I'll give you the Confessions for you to read a number of these key episodes from Augustine's life for yourself. But why does all of this matter, right? Why spend a module just talking about Augustine's life, which doesn't seem to be really kind of doing theology the same way as like looking at the Arian controversy. But I do think it is important, right? Because Augustine's experiences in his life really shape the way that he does theology in an important way. And I think it's good for us to reflect on that, because it will allow us to better understand what Augustine ends up teaching and writing. And it will also, I think, be helpful for us in terms of reflecting on how it is that we might do this in our own day. Right, so how does all of this shape Augustine's theology? Right, well, the most obvious way it shapes his theology is in connection with the biggest struggle in Augustine's life, right? So Augustine's greatest struggle, when you read the Confessions, is clearly this struggle with chastity, right? That he feels this, the force of temptation and sin in his life is just something that he is unable to break with, right? And it is an overwhelming power. And he can decide intellectually that he needs to change his life, but he finds himself helpless to actually accomplish this. And this is going to have a dramatic impact on the way that he understands human nature. It's going to have a dramatic impact on the way he understands original sin and its effect on human nature. It's going to have a radical impact on his understanding of how salvation works and of how grace works. Right? So this is all going to shape Augustine's thinking and teaching in a way that really emphasizes the power of sin, the disastrous effects of sin on human nature, but then is also going to dramatically influence his presentation of the power of God's grace, right? And that you have this very real sense of sin in Augustine's thought, but together with that you also have a very profound sense of the power of grace, right? That it can really reach someone even as sinful as Augustine himself experienced himself to be, so that God's grace is given a great deal of power in Augustine's thought. And we're going to see that when we look at his thought on a whole bunch of different things, ranging from the sacraments to the nature of the church to his understanding of heaven. All of these things, the power of grace is really what drives Augustine's theology. There are other things that come into play as well, of course, through Augustine's life story, right? So that immersion in Neoplatonic thought is going to have an influence, right? That Augustine is going to think about human nature in ways that, in many ways, reflect Neoplatonic thinking, right? That this conception of the person is made up of body and soul, this focus on the higher, the intellectual, the spiritual as being kind of the ideal. When Augustine goes to think about the Trinity, for example, how does he do that, right? He's not like St. Patrick. He's not going to go out and find kind of a physical metaphor for the Trinity. Augustine says, well, the closest we can get to God is through internal, intellectual, spiritual reflection, right? So in his work on the Trinity, which is, again, very famous and very influential, Augustine uses kind of internal reflection as the route to come to the highest good or God. And again, that's a very Neoplatonic idea that we find the ultimate truth not through engagement with the physical world, but through the intellect and through reflection within ourselves. At the same time, Augustine isn't just a kind of Christian Neoplatonist, right? Because he also has had this experience with Manichaeanism. And they're dualists, right? And the body is a bad thing that ought to be left behind. And Augustine reacts against that, right? So the Neoplatonics aren't big fans of the body, and Augustine likes them, but he knows that the Manicheans are completely off track and that he doesn't want to have that approach to things. And so against the Manicheans, Augustine is going to insist on the goodness of bodily creation, the goodness of the bodily world. And so that's going to kind of temper, if you will, the Neoplatonic disregard for the body. Augustine is going to insist that the body is ultimately good, even if the body does bring up the opportunity for certain temptations. So Augustine's different phases in his life are going to shape the way he thinks about the body, the way he thinks about the spirit. So that's why having a sense of what he's gone through can be helpful in understanding what he's writing. And then again, of course, that sense of just the power of sin and temptation when we get later in Augustin's career, when he's dealing with those very authoritarian, rigorous Donatist heretics, and when he gets on toward the last part of his career, when he's dealing with Pelagianism, which is a heresy that's going to be prompted in part by Augustin's teaching, both of those groups are going to make this argument that it's possible for a real serious Christian to avoid sin. And Augustine's own experience throughout the entirety of his life is going to make it abundantly clear to him that completely avoiding sin is something that human nature is not capable of. And so he is going to argue against both the Donatists and the Pelagians, again, rooted in his own experience of the power of sin, the effects of original sin, and the necessity, even after baptism, for just continual support from God's grace. So we're going to see how all of those experiences in his life shape his responses to these different controversies, all the way up to the end of his life when he dies kind of mid-argument with a number of prominent Pelagians. All right, so that's kind of the big overview. What I just want to finish with here before sending you off to the confessions is just to encourage you to reflect on what this means for how do we properly do theology, right? How is it that Augustine does theology? What he is arguably the most important theologian in Western Christianity since St. Paul. Aquinas, you could maybe make an argument, is kind of his equal. But that's basically it, right? He is the person who shapes Western Christian thinking more than just about any other. And so how does he do that? How does he practice his theology? And I think it's very helpful to notice, right, that Augustine is not driven by abstract intellectual philosophical concerns. He certainly is one of the great minds of history. But if we look at what he does and what he focuses on and the positions that he's going to argue for, I think you can really see how it is shaped by his real lived experience of his faith, right? His theology comes out of his own experience of his faith, his own experience of God's grace in his life, his own experience of the power of sin and temptation. So he is not some ivory tower intellectual who's engaged in theology as kind of this discipline that's his job. His theology really grows out of his own personal struggles, his own personal experience of the church and of God's grace. So this is not just his career or just his job. This is his life, both in terms of his experiences and in terms of what he's thinking and writing and preaching about. I think it's also very helpful, when we look at Augustine's works on a library shelf, you can see all of these volumes. You can see on the Trinity. You can see his account of the city of God and how human history relates to divine history. You can look at his accounts of the sacraments. And again, it can seem as if it's a very abstract academic approach to his faith. But if you actually look at how his whole life unfolds and the things that he writes in the course of his life, in the course of his career as a priest and a bishop, you can see that the issues that he's addressing are in fact the pressing issues of his day, right? So Agustin, for almost the entirety of his working career, when he's producing the writings that we have today, is a priest, and then for the most part he is a bishop, right? So he is a pastor. He has a flock that he is caring for on a day-to-day basis. And again, if you ever have the time, I would encourage you to not just read the big famous works on the Trinity, the Confessions, the City of God, all of these things, but also read some of the sermons, right? Because when you read Augustine's sermons, there were people who took notes, who copied down kind of as ancient stenographers Augustine's sermons, and we actually have a considerable number of them. You can see how Augustine talks to his people, to his congregation, to his flock, and it gives you a whole other aspect of his personality, which is really nice, I think. But when Augustine is even doing his formal theology, the kind of stuff that we read in theology and that we'll talk about in this class, his concerns are still driven by what are the things that are affecting the lives of his people. How does he deal with the Donatists who are claiming that the baptisms of his congregation, for example, aren't valid. That's a really serious problem, right? If you are worrying that the sacraments that you received aren't valid because you've heard these guys making this argument, that's something that Augustine as a bishop has to respond to. When you have people who are wondering about whether or not it is okay for them to get married or not, right? That is something that you are going to have to respond to as a pastor, as a bishop. When you hear people wondering about whether or not they have to keep themselves sinless to be a true Christian, again, this is something that is going to be vitally important for you as a pastor, right? So a lot of these things, and basically I would say almost all of the things Augustine writes, really flow out of a real pastoral concern and a real concern for what is going to be for the good of the church in his day. Even something like the City of God, which might seem, it's this grand retelling of history from the beginning up to basically Augustine's day, and it seems like the sort of project an academic would just come up with. But I think if you look at what's happening when Augustine writes this, that's not even what's going on in this case, right? That Augustine's people are facing the collapse of the Roman Empire around them, right? The world as they know it, the Roman Empire had seemed like for generations that it was permanent, that this was the way things are. And they see that collapsing around them. Obviously, people are going to be deeply distraught, confused, scared. So Augustine, I think, writes the City of God to explain how the relationship works between our human political lives and institutions and God's plan. But he does that, again, not from purely academic concerns, but as a way of explaining things to his people that is going to allow them to cope with and deal with these dramatic changes going on in their lives. So I think really Augustine is a wonderful example of how theology ought to be integrated with a personal Christian life, and how it also ought to be directed towards the good of the church and the people around us. So, to start us with Augustine, I'm going to give you some sections from the Confessions to read, and then we can come back and talk about them. And then next time we will start diving into looking at Augustine's works of theology, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun.